Hi, I'm Catherine Carlisle, Director of Engagement for the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. On behalf of our Board of Trustees and President Robert Leith, I'm delighted to welcome you to Edgewater, an 1820s classical revival home located in the sublime Hudson River Valley of New York. The founder of the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust, Richard Hampton Jenrette, had a special affinity for Edgewater, falling in love with the house and grounds during his very first visit in the fall of 1969. After making it his home for almost 50 years, Mr. Jenrette bequeathed Edgewater to the foundation he created so that its magnificent classical architecture, exceptional collection of American decorative arts, and scenic historic landscape could be used to educate and inspire the public and the next generation of professionals in each of these fields, making it an ideal setting for today's program. A South Carolinian named Lowndes Brown and his wife Margaretta Livingston built the home on a small jetty along the Hudson River in 1824. 28 years later, Robert Donaldson, a banker from North Carolina, purchased Edgewater from the widowed Mrs. Brown. Donaldson employed architect Alexander Jackson Davis and landscape architect Andrew Jackson Downing to further harmonize the home with its natural setting. The trio understood the intersection of architecture, landscape, and aesthetics. From the house, Edgewater provides inspiring views from nearly every room, while historic plats indicate nearby locations for equally scenic views overlooking the river. Weeping willow and beech trees line the shore, and an alley of black locust trees frame views of the river and the Catskill Mountains beyond, a landscape that proved to be so inspiring and captivating for artists of the Hudson River School. The Edgewater landscape has been an important and influential feature of this property for all of its previous owners and visitors, and today we honor that legacy by welcoming you for this Bunny Mellon curricula presentation from the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art.
It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Listening to Land, Cultural Landscape Research and Contemporary Practice with Thomas Woltz, part of the ICAA's Bunny Mellon curricula. At the ICAA, we believe that architecture, design, craftsmanship, and landscaping are deeply entwined, and all are vital ingredients that must work together to create lasting and meaningful places. To that end, the ICAA introduced the Bunny Mellon curricula in January of 2020, named in honor of my grandmother and her deeply held commitment that architecture is firmly linked to its surrounding landscape. This legacy extends from William Kent's groundbreaking work to the innovations of contemporary practitioners. My grandmother was first and foremost a teacher, so the incorporation of landscape design within the ICAA's remarkable educational programming ensures her legacy will continue to inspire future generations of talented architects and landscape designers. I am so honored to witness the continued expansion of the Bunny Mellon curricula, making it available to thousands globally. We are thrilled to partner with the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust at the historic Edgewater Estate on the Hudson River for this installment in our Bunny Mellon lecture series, featuring landscape designer Thomas Woltz. Like my grandmother, Thomas Woltz prides himself on a body of work that integrates the beauty and function of built forms with a keen understanding of context and ecological processes. From public parks to models of biodiversity and sustainable agriculture, Thomas's work has been lauded for pioneering innovative ecological solutions in the face of climate extremes. Projects within his conservation agriculture studio have yielded tens of thousands of acres of reforested land, reconstructed wetlands, native meadows, and wildlife habitat. In this lecture, Thomas will describe how his design work infuses places where people live, work, and play with narratives of the land that inspire stewardship. His commitment to wildlife and creating natural spaces beautifully and meaningfully honors Bunny Mellon's legacy, and I am so honored to now present Thomas Woltz. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for that kind introduction. It is truly a pleasure to be back at Edgewater today. I would like to thank the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust for hosting us at this beautiful historic site, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art for producing this program, and a very special thanks to the sponsors of the Bunny Mellon curricula, without whom this would not be possible. I've entitled my talk today, Listening to the Land, Cultural Landscape Research in Contemporary Practice. What I want to communicate today, using 3 projects from our firm, Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects, is the process of listening deeply to the land to inspire us to all kinds of responses, whether that's preservation, adaptation, rehabilitation of historic sites, or whether it's entirely new landscapes that never before existed, but that find their authentic inspiration in the work of deep research. Now, that research might be ecological research into from glacial history to today within the ecology of the site, and it also might be cultural research connected. These 2 things are interconnected throughout human history, where human beings came to an ecology, they transformed that ecology in hand transformed them, and so there's been this dance back and forth forever between culture and ecology. So when we dig into this research, thanks to having conservation biologists on staff, and thanks to having cultural landscape historians on staff, the design team and communication with these 2 departments digs very deeply to find the authentic stories of place. I'm going to begin today with a little bit of on the boards, just to let you know what's happening within the world of our firm in the sector of historic preservation and adaptation of historic sites. This is only a portion of what we do, but I thought for today's talk it would be relevant for this audience. We've just completed a restoration of the historic grounds of the John Jay Heritage Center. We are currently working on Olana and the landscape of Frederick Church, the John and Alice Coltrane Home, which is a recent project of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the African American Heritage Preservation Fund. We're also working at another National Trust property, Filoli, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Monticello Burial Ground for the Enslaved is a project that's going under construction right now. And the Mount Cuba Center Phase 1 has just been completed, following a master plan that MBW completed for that institution only a few years ago. And we're just in the throes of planning work at Winterthur, also near Wilmington, Delaware. So that's just a few of the on-the-boards projects that we're very excited about and that have used the process that I described in my introduction. So let's begin with the first project. This is the Crown and Shield Garden at Hagley. Hagley is a 235-acre estate in the Brandywine Valley, and it is the very first DuPont project or settlement in the United States. When E.I. DuPont came to the United States after the Revolution in France, he built his house in 1802 and the Eleutherian Mills. The Eleutherian Mills was a powder works creating gunpowder. He chose this site on the banks of the Brandywine, and what we're seeing is an incredibly interesting and layered landscape. The powder works exploded in 1917, devastating the structures that were just below the main house. This led the family to move in 1921 off of the property. A descendant, Louise Crowninshield, and her husband Frank Crowninshield acquired the property and set about transforming the ruins of the original 1802 powder works into America's most unique garden, I think. It is a neoclassical garden that they built copying inspiration, taking inspiration from Italy and their travels abroad. So I thought I would walk you through this because what we've done for the board at Hagley is create really a toolkit for the adaptation of this site in the 21st century. And I thought it might be useful to walk you through that process. This aerial is of the garden in its current state. All that has happened is invasive brush that has grown up over the past 50 or so years had obscured the garden entirely. So it has been cleaned up, and we are building the toolkit for restoration and preservation of this incredibly important landscape. Outlined in white on this aerial, you will see the land holdings of Hagley, as I said, 235 acres on the Brandywine River. And here you're seeing the Museum of Industry and the remains of the powder works along the Brandywine River, the Crown and Shield Garden in the center, and then Hagley and its spectacular potager garden to the north. This is the front facade of the house that E.I. DuPont began in the early 1800s. And imagine just behind this and down the hill is the Crown and Shield Garden. It's important to recognize that from the level of this house to the Brandywine is 90 feet of grade change. So the gardens built as powder works into the side of the hillside, transformed into gardens, have this incredible dialogue with the geology of the site. This is an aerial from the 20s that shows the extent of the Crown and Shield Garden. You can see the cedar alley, you can see the follies and ruins that, that Mr. and Mrs. Crown and Shield envisioned as they built this garden. This is, now that the site has been opened up and cleared of invasive plants and a few storm casualties of important trees, unfortunately, we have this open view down over the Crown and Shield. So this was from a site visit just a few weeks ago with the Director of Horticulture, Paul Orpello, who called me and he said, Thomas, you have to get to the site in these weeks right now because thanks to the clearing of the site, the incredible diverse palette of so many of the plants have exploded, just erupted. It's absolutely fabulous. So here we're looking down from where I took that last photograph into the garden, and you can start to understand this extraordinary collection of ruins and beautiful garden spaces. Here's the path down to the garden. This is looking at one of the cauldrons that was used in the process of making powder, and you're seeing an opening to a grotto down below. So really this incredible sort of fantasia of gardens. You might look at these photographs and say, don't touch it. And I very much agree. I would say don't ruin it. But it's also important to understand that this, as a publicly accessible landscape, does have to meet certain essential requirements. So for example, the small black fence you can see just in the foreground of this image, that's a hole that drops maybe 18 feet to a grotto that's down below. So that's, you know, sort of knee height. So we have to make careful and respectful insertions into this garden to make it a safe place for those who don't know it. And that's where rehabilitation of the garden comes in. It's absolutely stunning. I wanted to show you a few pictures that are the current state juxtaposed with some of the historic images from the 1920s. This is the current state of the upper reflecting pool. You can see the terraced gardens. Now, this wall to the right in this image was part of the original refinery and powder works. So built into it are these insertions of Italianate colonnades, arcades, balustrades, and grottos. This is an image from the 1920s that really shows the beauty of this incredible composition. Here again, we're thinking about guardrails, handrails, the safety of the public. These are essential considerations for a public garden today. So the task of understanding and evaluating the state of the ruins was the very first step. This evaluation was done hand in hand with Silman Engineering. Bancroft is the construction company that has been advising us on what are the tools we need to give Hagley so that this garden can be appropriately and safely rehabilitated. As you can imagine, there are many, many springs in this hillside. All of the water features of the garden were naturally fed by spring water. Now, that spring water continues to flow, and it flows through walls and under foundations, and it freezes, and it causes a tremendous amount of undermining of these architectural elements, rendering them quite unsafe. So I just want you to think a minute about this as a ruin in need of restoration, designed as a ruin of this neoclassical garden that was built on top of a ruin. So we sort of joke in the office that it's a ruin on a ruin on a ruin, and how do you preserve and protect that when it all feels so fragile? This is an image of it when it was built. So you see, it's not, it was never sharp and crisp. So to arrive back at that point, bring it that stability for the long term without destroying it, that is the charge at hand. Another couple of images of the current state of the garden and the former state of the garden. Such an extraordinary and important garden. And the fact that it's on the very first production site for the DuPont family's corporation and is such a work of artistry, in our minds, it really bridges industry and art of America in a way that really no other garden does. And it's essentially a portrait of the DuPont family in the United States from the very first years of the 19th century to today. An image of the upper tank looking from the mosaic terrace in need of restoration. And this is an image of it from the 1920s, looking across that reflecting pool. Here's an analysis diagram looking at the different routes through the garden and what can be accessible for universal accessibility. What are the safest routes in order to share this extraordinary garden with the most public possible. This diagram breaks the site into three different categories. You're seeing the rehabilitation in the sort of pale peach color. You're seeing the major projects for restoration, and then in the purple, you're seeing the handful of small projects for complete reconstruction. So let me unpack that a little bit. We've worked according to the Department of the Interior standards for restoration and historic preservation. So rehabilitation are parts of the garden that we can gently transform without destroying the character or the historic integrity of the garden. And then the areas for discrete restoration projects, we have the artifacts, they are in good shape enough to rebuild them as they once were. The complete reconstruction projects are only three small areas, but those are pieces of the garden that are gone. And we do have the photographic documentation accurate enough to be able to rebuild them from the ground up. So this is a kind of guide for Hagley to say, what is the treatment according to the Department of the Interior standards, and what is appropriate for each part of the garden. Here are images of those different rehabilitation zones, a lot of historic photographs showing what we would bring the garden back to. Then the discrete restoration projects highlighted in orange on this drawing. Here are images of those restoration projects. As you can see, there's a lot to do, but it's very exciting work. And then the discrete construction projects come down to this magnificent gate that was a gate that they copied from a villa outside of Rome. The lower right image is a painting that hangs in Hagley of the garden once it was completed. And that document has actually been extraordinarily useful to the design team and our partners on the staff at Hagley. I mentioned Silman Engineering and what an incredible partnership that has been. So look at this structure and see how it is crumbling. How do we document it and rebuild it in a way that is faithful to the original concepts? These are engineering drawings that show you how water can be captured before entering the walls or undermining the walls, drained outside of the walls to prevent freeze-thaw action from creating further damage, and how we can manage the reconstruction of these retaining walls as we negotiate this tremendous amount of slope down to the Brandywine River. Here's another diagram showing you showing you how the rebuilding of these historic retaining walls can make way for the level parts of the garden to be completely rehabilitated. This is the final plan, and I want to show you how we've unpacked the layers so that projects can be identified and done in a coherent way. And it worked out fairly well to describe these terrace by terrace. So this axonometric drawing gives you the entire garden in one bird's eye view. So the top layer is this origin source fountain and the cedar allée with a temple that overlooks the rest of the garden. The next plan is showing you the reflecting pool and the mosaic terrace. The next plan is the lower reflecting pool and rhododendron garden. And then along the Brandywine is a beautiful mill race walk. To also give useful tools, we took images of the existing conditions, which you're seeing in this image, and then we did Photoshop renderings that show what this garden could become. In this image, you're seeing the entry to a grotto, and then in the next image, you're seeing this rendering of what that garden fully restored would look like. In this image, you're seeing the reflecting pool, and here, what that could look like restored. You'll see that we're intentionally capturing this ruined quality of the garden. The next image is the overall hydraulic situation, a very complex situation for this garden. As you see, all of these springs captured into beautiful water features that bring all of those springs down through the architecture of the garden to the Brandywine. Here are images of those water features. We then have delivered a horticultural package analyzing the canopy cover, done an inventory of the flowering trees, an analysis of all the existing trees. Here you're seeing the ornamental trees in pink. And then working with Paul Orpello very closely, we generated as a team this diagram that shows you dappled shade, dry shade, wet, full sun, full shade, in order to generate the plant lists based on the historic horticulture. So here are the sample historic plant lists with the flowers that we know Louise Crowninshield purchased because they still have the receipts and the record books of all of these acquisitions. So we know a huge amount about the horticulture that was there. Many plants are coming back today. And then we made plant lists zone by zone appropriate to the soil, sun, and moisture conditions that exist on the site. So just run through these different palettes. But again, we're building the toolkit for success for Hagley to make a complete rehabilitation and restoration of the Crowninshield Garden. So I end on this bird's eye perspective once more, and just could not be more excited about having had the honor of working on this project. The next project I'd like to walk you through is a very, very small project. It's a tiny part of Centennial Park, which is a terrific park in Nashville, Tennessee. Very historic park. This is an aerial of the park itself, and in the center of the park is the replica of the Parthenon that was built in 1897 for the Centennial Exposition. In this image, this historic image of the Centennial Exposition, you can see the Parthenon at the center and 50 to 60 other palaces and temples built mostly out of wood and stucco that were these, like many of the great exposition events of that era, they were all demolished. Only the Parthenon was rebuilt, and then the site was transformed into a public park. We were brought on to create the master plan that you're seeing on the screen now, and in doing so, we asked to have a period of deeper research. Well, that research led to some remarkable findings. We started with the prehistoric or even glacial era history of the site. The site of Nashville is on karst geology. That is very, very porous limestone, and water runs readily through this limestone. This limestone that was exposed through erosion has layers of salt in it, attracting bison to the banks of the Cumberland River. This is called the Great Salt Lick, was what brought so much wildlife to the banks of the river. So Native Americans hunted these bison on very predictable hunting routes through the city. Colonial settlers arrived and used those pre-existing trails as the first roads through Nashville. So lesson to everyone, if there are problems for traffic in Nashville, don't let bison design your city plan. But what I find incredibly fascinating is that this extrusion of salt led to a response from wildlife, that led to a response from Native Americans, that led to a response from colonial Americans, that led to the structure of the city. What an extraordinary layered history that we were able to find in this city. This map is actually a very sad map. This is a map of the 3 major outbreaks of cholera. Karst also communicates not just fresh water, but also septic water, and many, many people died. Nashville was in a true public health crisis in the mid-19th century. Nashville was one of the first cities in the United States to invest in a major public water works. In 1877, the reservoir of 8th Street was built, this magnificent elliptical sand filtration plant, and many of the creeks and streams throughout the city were put into pipes underground. Subsequently, many of those pipes were directed to the sewage treatment plant because they combined sewer outflow and fresh water. So, through our research, we found letters of people coming from the Natchez Trace to Nashville, workers who would float the boats and barges down the Mississippi River and then return on foot to Nashville. And in some of the letters, they would say, "I knew I was home when I had the fresh, cool waters of Cockrell Spring at the end of the Natchez Trace." Well, this is a photograph from the newspaper in 1959, and Natchez Trace dead ends into the gates of the park. And in our deed research, we found that Anne Cockrell, a pioneer woman, the first woman to have deed and title west of the Appalachian Mountains, that this was her farm that she managed. She also built the first school in colonial Nashville. Where is her spring? Let's find it. So we set about an exploration with officials from Public Works, from the City Water Authority and the city parks, and after a good deal of guessing and digging, we discovered the original Cockrell Spring. 110 gallons of fresh water coming out of the stone beneath the city and being drained right to the sewage treatment plant. So we thought, this is a moment, if we bring this water up, that is an authentic moment of the history of colonial Nashville in this park, and let's create something extraordinary. Now, we're not recreating anything, we're not rehabilitating anything. There's no trace of where this was, except at the bottom of this hole, we found the original 4-foot by 4-foot limestone wellhead. So we began a design for the Cockrell Spring, where we're daylighting Anne Cockrell's historic spring, and it's to the right in this drawing, right along West End Avenue at the intersection of Natchez Trace and West End Boulevard. Here's a drone image of that part of the park, and I'll direct your attention to the far right of this image. And here is an aerial looking down on this very, very small little parklet. It's a piece of a much bigger master plan for Centennial Park. So what you're seeing in the lower left is a small terrace with this square source where the fresh spring water surges up around the wellhead that is floated, suspended inside of that tank. Then a channel of water, or a rill, takes the water out into the landscape. The water is allowed to spread out to a constructed wetland that further polishes the water. And then it's captured in a cistern, sent to the lake, and pumped back for irrigation throughout the park. So imagine all of this fresh water going formerly for the past, I don't know, almost 200 years to a sewage treatment plant, and now is being used completely in the park. Here is a rendering that we used for fundraising. The funding came in for this, and here is the built image of the Cockrell Spring. A couple more detail images. This is the wellhead, the historic wellhead at the center of the fountain, and you can see the rill. Now what's wonderful here is because it's fresh spring water, is that children can hop in this and play all they want. The water cascades down into the rill. The rill moves through this constructed native wetland and spreads out to nourish these plants, bringing greater biodiversity to the park. And also all of the plants around Cockrell Spring are native to central Tennessee and would have been present when Anne Cockrell lived here. So through the horticulture and through the water, we hold hands with history in this very authentic moment. But it is not an historic recreation. I think that's very important, how history can inspire contemporary design. This diagram may not be the most beautiful image in my presentation, but for me it's fascinating because this is the hydrologic flow, the engineering of capturing that spring water, getting it to the lake, and then pumping it back through the irrigation network of the park. This is offsetting millions and millions of gallons of drinking water that would have been used for irrigation. These are just some photos of people enjoying the park. The one in the upper center was a solar eclipse, and the park was absolutely filled, and people really enjoying this authentic moment of history. This is the son of a friend of mine who lives in Nashville, and I asked if I could use this picture of his son really putting the rill to work. This for me feels incredible. This place that never existed, being enjoyed by someone who might just grow up to be a landscape architect or an historian or a preservationist. Let's hope. The last project I'd like to share with you is Memorial Park in Houston, Texas. Now, I've shown you a pure restoration and rehabilitation project of a garden. I've shown you a public park, a new very small landscape within a much larger park, a landscape that never existed before. And now I'm going to show you a massive project that is, in fact, twice the size of Central Park in the heart of Houston. Memorial Park finds itself between uptown and downtown Houston and has been thought of in the past century as really Houston's urban forest. What that means, unfortunately, is that it is a forest that has gone untended for the past century. It is primarily invasive exotic plants, and we were only brought on board because after 4 years of drought from 2010 to 2014, an estimated 80% of the tree canopy of this park died. That is a massive, massive amount of forest death in an urban setting. Remember, 1,500 acres of forest in the middle of the city. Now, it had some amenities that had really accreted over time, but there had never been a comprehensive planning effort. So a group of private citizens got together, created the Memorial Park Conservancy. The City Parks Department, the Houston Parks and Recreation Department, along with the mayor, came together with a tax increment reinvestment zone, and it was a perfect storm of support. And these visionary leaders said, we must create a long-term master plan for this site. This is a really important part of landscape architecture, in my personal opinion, and the way our firm tries to operate. We are doing projects not for today, not for the temporary, but for the next century, and hopefully much, much more. So we were not daunted by the scale of death in this forest, because we know that a healthy forest can self-regenerate. A healthy forest, if we get that ball rolling again, can be an extraordinary self-sustaining ecosystem, even in the third largest metropolitan area in the United States. Here's a diagram just making the point with the greensward plan of Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted overlaid 2 times on the footprint of Memorial Park. Here is an image pre-drought, before 2010, and here at 2014, after the drought. You see the amount of death across the park. Truly a landscape of devastation. In our early ecological analysis, teaming with regional conservation biologists in the firm Byrd Oliver, we did surveys of the existing biodiversity, and the left image shows you how depauperate this landscape was. very little ecological richness. In the right, thanks to looking at soil studies, hydrology, we started to imagine what ecosystems would have existed in this landscape long ago. Let's let that guide us, because drought will come again and floods will come again to Houston. This we can be sure of in the 21st century, facing climate extremes. So if we can invest in the most resilient native ecosystems, they are also the most authentic to this region. So, biological surveys to understand what wildlife is in the park. There are a lot of snapping turtles along the south shore of the park, which is the Buffalo Bayou. This is a soil pit that, working with soil scientists, we discovered that at the bottom of this pit were parallel layers of ash, indicating that likely 400 years ago, this site was burned as a prairie by the Karankawa Native people to manage it for bison. So the idea that the layers are deep and long, and they begin with the ecology, they were managed by Native Americans, then with the colonial revival and the westward expansion, the Native American populations were tragically removed, and we have this next chapter coming to the site. Our goal is that what we now deliver is an inclusive and comprehensive landscape plan that acknowledges these different layers of the site and sets in motion the most healthy ecosystems possible. This does not mean that it's not the fruit of great design. So I want to show you this one project that will demonstrate how we hope we have set in motion a new scale of design. The overall master plan of the 1,500 acres was completed about 4 years ago. The origins of Memorial Park began with the Hogg family, who purchased the land and created a buyback agreement with the city of Houston. During Miss Hogg's life, Hair and Hair landscape architects were engaged to do a study. This is the only drawing that we have, but I will call your attention to the upper right area. There's a circular shape, an ovoid shape, with a greenhouse in it, and it says garden. And the rest of it is really intended to be a wilderness area for horseback riding and hiking. So we have ecological history, cultural history, recent cultural history through the Hair and Hair drawing, and this is what we've put together as a comprehensive master plan for the park. The far right area, that ovoid shape, that is what I want to focus on today, and then I'll bring you back to an area just along the railroad tracks in closing. This is called the Eastern Glades. This is a piece of the park that never existed before, but drew its inspiration from the intention of Hair and Hair to have some formal gesture. Now, what we discovered in our historic research is that this landscape, before the Hogg family purchased it to become a park, was Camp Logan. It was a training camp for thousands of soldiers in World War I. And it was Miss Hogg's vision that this landscape of the training camp be preserved as a public park in memory of the soldiers who fought and gave their lives for our freedom. The line you're seeing running east-west is the extension of Blossom Street in Houston, and that was the historic gate to Camp Logan. So we thought, let us acknowledge this entryway, and then at the far west of the park, before the railroad tracks, acknowledge the actual presence of those soldiers on site. So you're seeing a large elliptical sort of multi-purpose ground for picnicking and playing pickup sports. But you're also seeing the excavation of a large lake that did not exist in the park before. And this is a step toward resiliency. So with the rainfall typical in Houston, we can capture enough water to meet a substantial quantity of the irrigation needs of the park, introduce greater biodiversity, and a new amenity for the people of Houston. Now, this park had a road running directly north-south through this. So one of the more ambitious ideas of this was to move that road to the far east, establish parking along the perimeter, and allow this to be a completely pedestrian zone and facilitate a large new landscape at the heart of the park. This is a rendering that was used for fundraising purposes. This is phase one, where you can still see the road, but the eastern side of the parking and the park have been constructed. On this slide, you're seeing the entry gates that acknowledge and explain to the public this historic way into the park. Now, we're not recreating the old gate of Camp Logan. This isn't Camp Logan anymore, but we wanted to acknowledge that this axis has a lot of energy and a lot of history to it. So we made it monumental. It's a welcoming pedestrian gate, but it's a welcome to all the people of Houston. And this axis runs all the way behind this image to the heart of downtown Houston. Now, these monumental piers, again, back to this idea that a landscape should last for centuries, these monumental piers mark this axis, but they are carved of regional limestone and then fire-glazed brick are in the spanning the walls in between. Here's some construction images. This was on a site visit. That's me with the hard hat and a roll of drawings. But I wanted to include these because so often the landscape in major projects is imperiled by budgets. And so many projects we have had where, in order for the architecture to be complete, the landscape budget has to be sacrificed or phased, or it never happens. And in this project, there was such a commitment from the people of Houston, the donors and supporters of this, and the vigilance of both the Parks Department and the Memorial Park Conservancy, that they committed to the highest level of quality and that the artifacts and amenities we would create would last for centuries. So just sharing this image of this beautiful three-dimensional curve of the limestone toothed into the fire-glazed brick. I also have to make an enormous thanks to Jeff Ayton and Jeremy Jordan and Taryn Jensfold and the people from Nelson Byrd Woltz who vigilantly detailed every bit of these amenities to express the ideas in this beautiful and permanent way. I put this in as a little bit of comic relief, but also this is my expression of gratitude for quality, someone committing to longevity in the public landscape. This is rare that you get a piece of limestone the size of a minivan. So I'm very grateful and needed to express my love that day on the construction site. This is an image of the park that opened in June of 2020 during COVID and was immediately a huge resource for people struggling through the pandemic. This is a construction site to show you just the scale of the endeavor of this landscape. The buildings that you're seeing are public open-air pavilions, very frequently used immediately upon opening, and this major terrace overlooking a new lake at the heart of the park. Here is the terrace overlook completed. You can see how these large pillars are sort of beacons out over the water, and people can enjoy being lakeside. This is a place that never existed in the park before, and people have been, I think, deeply nourished during the pandemic to have such immediate, in the heart of the city, contact with what feels like big and expansive Texas nature. This is the axis that runs all the way back to downtown, and this boardwalk where we've created a shelf for greater biodiversity of the horticultural community. This is an image, that same shot of it complete, almost complete, just before opening last May. Here are images of the pavilions done in collaboration with English architects, people using this multi-purpose lawn and the event pavilions. Our ecological message is infused throughout, so all of the stormwater captured by the roofs is taken into stormwater gardens, moved through the park, cleaned, and delivered to the Buffalo Bayou. Here is one of those swales, so you're constantly aware of it because all the drainage is open air, not in pipes, and these small bridges take you across these very rich, biodiverse swales of native plants. Here's an image of the boardwalk as you move around the far curve of the lake, and then a drone image looking back at that amphitheater and the continuation of the axis all the way to the memorial groves. We love to, in this combination of design and science, we love to educate people about the dynamics of nature, that nature is never static. So here you're seeing these blocks of limestone with the elevation of the water that depends on rainfall. You can stand on the different blocks and understand exactly what the water level of the lake is on that day. We also added these boardwalks that immerse you in an existing wetland that was within the forest. So zooming out, you see the amphitheater, the lake, the eastern glade, the overlook, and you can see just at the bottom of this image the boardwalk making its way like pickup sticks or fallen trees in a forest, creating access, safe access through the wetland without damaging any of the ground plane. And here's that Big Sky, Texas view in the middle of the city. So this is something that I think my whole team and I are very excited to see. I will say that despite 5 years of planning, there are incredible surprises like this one that happened this winter. You can really see the composition of this design, again, rooted in history and culture and ecology, but it's so graphic in snow. This may never happen again in my lifetime, but I thought I would end that portion with this image that is such an extraordinary surprise in what was absolutely a tragic event, an unexpected event for Houston. But I thought the power of this image was a good one to end this portion on. The last thing I'll leave you with is something that we're just beginning the design development on, and this is the memorial groves within Memorial Park. One of the things that we discovered early in the research is that there was very little acknowledgement that this was a training camp. The entire thing was a training camp for World War I soldiers, cavalry, munitions. It was a massive tent city. If you imagine, it's mostly canvas. Tents were 15 feet on center throughout the site, and the only buildings of permanence were latrines, shower buildings, an officer's building. Very little was left in the park, and therefore it had been forgotten. With the more than 3,300 citizens of Houston who engaged in our public process, we realized very few understood why this was called Memorial Park. There were no traces left, really. So we set about creating a powerful way to remember. I think landscapes uniquely have that power of triggering a deep remembering. So we set aside 100 acres that you're seeing outlined here in white that are the memorial groves. Looking back at historic photographs, we realized the entire site had been cleared. There were a few pine trees standing alone, but most of the city was sheds, shelters, and of course, tents. Archaeologists helped us locate a handful of very modest remains. This is the footing and foundation of a latrine building. But you know what? It is the authentic remnant of Camp Logan. It's one of the few. And again, in that instinct to want to hold hands with history, authenticity is so rare in our world today that when you find it, you need to celebrate it. This diagram is outlining, again in white dots, the perimeter of the memorial groves, but you can see the scale of this operation. So this historically was not a pristine forest. This had been many things over time. This landscape was continuing to evolve. We hope that the layer that we are adding in this generation will be one that is self-sustaining, dynamic, and stable for centuries to come. I wanted to also mention this important layered history of some African-American heroes that a regiment was trained in segregation at Camp Logan. They, however, were not segregated in fighting, and they achieved extraordinary accomplishments of valor in war. There were, I believe, 18 Croix de Guerre awarded by France to the African-American troops trained at Camp Logan. this history also was not present in the park. So part of the Memorial Groves is to tell this story, tell the difficult and important stories of race and war and segregation, and we have the opportunity to do that in this powerful landscape. How do you create a living memorial today? It's a memorial of a place, but it's a place that had thousands and thousands of lives shaped by it, and many thousands of those lives perished. They perished in sacrifice for our lifestyle, for our lives. This image struck us as a powerful one, where you see the soldiers marching in formation on the left, and you see this Japanese forest of trees coming up a hill in the snow and petering out to just a single tree. And we thought, gosh, this used to be a timber operation at the park. This used to be a forest. It's been growing planted pines for generations. What if the idea of a constructed pine planting regimented at 15 feet on center, which was the distance of these soldiers' tents, but planted across 100 acres that would create these infinite galleries, almost like a cathedral, and that could be the living memorial to the soldiers marching in formation in this 100 acres. So this is the plan of the Memorial Groves at the concept level. We're just beginning to go into the development stages of this design, and you can see different areas set aside for gatherings, for interpretation, for events to happen within the forest, but the overall grid is thousands and thousands of loblolly pines planted on this perfect spacing. Here is a rendering for communicating the idea to the public, where you can see perhaps there's a memorial or a monument in the midst, but that really the forest is the memorial. And when you walk into this forest, you sense and feel the scale of sacrifice and the scale of operation that Camp Logan once was in World War I. This is my last image, and here you're seeing this sense of an expansive gallery of this cathedral-like space that this planting of pines could create as a memorial. Now, I mention this as a living memorial, and I mean that in a more subtle way than it might first appear. Yes, it is made of living things. Yes, it is pine trees planted to represent the lives of the soldiers. But to further that analogy and bring ongoing and permanent relevance to it, these trees, like humans, have a limited lifespan. We use paper every day. We use paper products constantly, and we do not like to think about where paper comes from, but it comes from pine trees. So we had an idea that with the 100 acres planted in loblolly pine, after 25 years of growth, which is the age that loblolly can be harvested for the timber industry, but you have to understand 25 years was the average age of the soldier killed in battle in World War I, of the soldiers trained at Camp Logan. So the idea is after 25 years after the Memorial Groves is planted, 1,000 trees, one regiment, will be on Memorial Day ceremonially felled. Those trees will be cut down, removed, cured, sawn, and go to Habitat for Humanity and other similar public housing authorities within the greater Houston region. So that life of that tree will be given in service to the community that tended it. On Armistice Day in November, 1,000 Houstonians will come to the site and plant the seedlings of that next generation. So every 5 years, a different regiment will be felled. If you see this horrific thing happen, you will never forget it. It's always such a deep emotional experience to see a tree cut down, but the sacrifice and the scale of sacrifice will be communicated to anyone who sees this, and the sense of hope of planting the next generation of life to keep this a living memorial in perpetuity is our goal. I want to thank you for spending this time with me. I hope these 3 projects have served to illustrate very different ways in which a deep commitment to history and preservation can shape the landscapes of our lives in ways that are long-term, permanent, self-sustaining, but that they tell us the stories of our humanity. Because after all, the stories of our entire existence lie in the soil beneath our feet. Our job is to reveal those, to tend them, steward them, and maintain them for future generations. It's been an honor to be here today. Thank you very much.